This morning, what we're going to be doing is taking a look at Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. So if you can turn in your Bibles to Genesis 11, 1 through 9, familiar story, the Tower of Babylon. So let's go ahead and turn there in our Bibles and begin. Verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. Will you pray with me? Father, thank you for your word. Thank you that you have given us your word that tells us the truth about the world around us. And it also tells us the truth about what is going on inside of our own hearts, something that can be so hard for us to see for ourselves. And so this morning, I pray that you would open up the eyes of our hearts to see your truth, that you are communicating to us through this passage, and that we would see the world around us differently as a result of that, and that we would operate in this world differently, the way you have called us to as a result of this. And we thank you, and we just ask that you would help me to communicate clearly this morning, that this would be helpful and practical and accurate. In your name, amen. Okay, so what I want to do, this is a familiar story if you've spent time in the Bible. What I'd like to do first is just acknowledge that there are various expectations when you come to a story like this one, the Tower of Babel. And let's just kind of put an asterisk next to that word, Babel. Some translations will translate this Babel here in Genesis 11, and prior to this in Genesis chapter 10. Other translations will call it Babylon. What is going on here is that Hebrew, if you didn't know this, is written all in consonants. That's how the language, ancient Hebrew, works. And so this word B-B-L, when it occurs here in Genesis 11, many translations call it Babel. But then the 260 times after this in the rest of the Old Testament, that same Hebrew word is always translated Babylon. And so this morning, there's a bit of a scholarly debate, but I believe that this is an intentional link that the author is trying to make, that this is the origin story of Babylon, and that it is going to play a major part, later on in the rest of the Old Testament, and that the reader of the Old Testament is supposed to see here, okay, this is how this place got started. And so I think that link is intentional, so I'll use that word Tower of Babylon, and we'll refer to the city as Babylon. Okay, back to various expectations when you come to this story. One set of expectations that maybe you're bringing to this story is what I will call the historical/archaeological validation. That is what you're hoping for when we come and preach this message. And when you go down this road, this is where you find information like the geography of the land of Shinar, which is in present-day Iraq. And you'll see pictures of what the Tower of Babylon probably looked like. And it'll be laid alongside modern excavations that are taking place in this land as we've dug up ancient, they're called ziggurats, and they'll be laid aside next to each other, and you'll find out, oh, this is what this probably looked like. Researching this passage, I also found a map from National Geographic representing early humanity's migration patterns as compiled by DNA evidence. And it corresponds eerily to the dispersion of the nations that's described here in Genesis 11. And so when you kind of have this mindset that this passage, what we should go for when we read this and study it is find out, how does the biblical text describe events in a way that is corresponding to what we are finding as we are digging up archaeological sites, and that is the whole point of studying this is to find that yes, in fact, the Bible tells us the truth about what actually happened in history. That is a valid project. Like, that is important in today's society, especially where there are so many doubts as to the historicity of the Bible. In fact, there's even an ESV study Bible that is titled the ESV Archaeology Study Bible. And so I don't want to discount the validity of that sort of project. But if that is the only set of expectations that you come to, you'll find that the authors of the Bible, they spend some time doing some strange things that don't correspond to proving that these events actually happen. The fact is that the biblical authors, their agenda isn't really to convince you that these events took place. Rather, their agenda is to retell history from a theological perspective, right? There's an assumption that the readers of the Bible already know that this event happened. And instead, what they're trying to do is frame this event from a theological perspective so that you can see it from God's perspective, okay? That is the agenda that is, when scriptural authors recount history, it is always to let you know, here's what happened and here's how God sees it, okay? There's a second sort of expectation, and I'll call this the life application story. And wouldn't you know it, there's an NIV Life Application Study Bible. And what this goal is, and I do want to acknowledge that the Bible is full of stories that will change your life, that you should take and immediately apply to your life. The Bible is full of those stories. Shoot, I grew up on stories like this, where you'll sort of chunk out the Bible and pick out different stories, and they all have a nice, neat application for you. Unfortunately for me, these stories were often attached to talking vegetables, so some of the hard edges were taken off of these stories. I missed out as a kid, maybe you can relate. So I will say this angle is also important. You should take the Bible and you should see, how does God want to transform my life as a result of this? But sometimes we go that route too quick. Sometimes we don't sit in the Bible long enough, and we try and just immediately draw out the application. Okay, try doing that to Ecclesiastes, right? Certain parts of it. You will end up in a dark place very quickly if you try and immediately apply some of the scripture. So what is going on here? What is our goal? You know, if we take that life application story, that method to this text, what are we going to find? Pride is bad. And maybe that's what you already think this sermon is going to be. Oh, yeah, pride is bad. If you build towers too high, God does not like that. Okay, so stay away from the bricks. He hates those bricks. You know, how do you apply a story like the Tower of Babel to your life? What we're going to do, the angle that we're going to take, we are going to spend time in verses 1 through 9. We are going to draw out, we're going to exposit, what does this passage teach us as it stands in verses 1 through 9. But then what I want to do is connect this passage to what has come before it and how it introduces themes and ideas that the scriptural authors are going to pick up and run with throughout the rest of the Bible, right? We're gonna find out how does this story of the Tower of Babylon introduce themes and ideas that scripture authors take and carry forward. The exciting twists and turns, unexpected developments that this theme introduces, how this theme finds its climax in the life, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ, and then how it finds its fulfillment and resolution in the new creation. So that's the second part of my project this morning. And then finally, what I want to do is, how do I, as a follower of Jesus, now operate in this new way of seeing the world that has been opened up to me? So that sort of sets the roadmap for what we are going to do this morning. Let's go ahead, and our first level of interaction is going to zoom in and draw out meaning out of just this passage as it stands in verses 1 through 9. And what we find, what we're introduced to in this passage is a society, an entire city that is unified together. I mean, listen to the language. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And then they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." So this is a cooperative project. This is a city that is unified in stark rebellion against God. Okay, so you know, a city is what we're introduced to that is unified in its rebellion against God. The first thing that this rebellious society is, and you're expecting something nefarious, they conspire together to make bricks, right? Our bricks and mortar is the first strange detail that we're introduced to in this passage. And what I want you to do is just put a pin in that detail. Oftentimes, the Bible, when it tells history, it is devoid of a lot of the detail that we're used to as modern readers. Like, we want to know what the characters looked like. We want to know their backstory. We want to know what kind of hair they had. Like, we want to know all sorts of things. The Bible, when it tells history, is really sparse. So when it does provide detail, pay attention to it. It might come in handy later. And in this case, it will. So just put a pin in those bricks and mortar. So how exactly was this society in rebellion against God? Verse 4 really gets to the specifics. What they wanted to do was make a name for themselves, and they didn't want to be spread over the face of the earth. Right? So that gets to the heart of their rebellion. Now, that might not sound like that big of a deal. Or maybe that sounds arrogant or prideful to you. But what makes it a big deal is when we connect this story back to Genesis chapter 2 and what God originally designed human beings to be and what he designed human beings to go out and do. So when we understand that, then this starts to really contrast with what God originally had in mind for the human project. So what did God create human beings to be in Genesis 2? Right? He created human beings unique, set apart from the rest of creation. He created human beings in his image, it says in Genesis 2, 27, 28. So what that means is that God specifically designed human beings to be his representatives, so that when the rest of creation looked at humans, they would get a sense for what God is like, right? That they would see humans, that they would reflect God, the way they go out and build culture, the way they interact with each other, the way they carry forward God's project that he started in Eden and go out and subdue and fill the earth, that they would see who God is like when they look at humans. And so what are they trying to do? They are not being God's representatives. It says, let's go and make a name for ourselves. Let's go out and represent ourselves. Let's make our name great. The exact opposite of what humans were created to do by God. And then what did God command humans to do? Again, in Genesis 2, he gives humanity a command to fill the earth, be fruitful, multiply, subdue it. And what are they conspiring together to do? The exact opposite of filling the earth. Let's all cluster together. Let's all hang out here, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. The point is that Babylon has taken God's plan for humanity and rejected it. They've defined good and evil on their own terms, just like Adam and Eve did in the garden. And they're trying to make their own name great instead of God's. So how is God going to respond to this rebellious society? What is he going to do about what is happening here in Babylon? Find out in verses 5 through 9. It says, "And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore, its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth." So how is God going to respond to this rebellious city of Babylon? Well, there's a lot of irony and sarcasm, especially in verses 5 and 7. One of the premier literary techniques of scriptural authors is to use irony and sarcasm against those that are foolish, that reject God, that ignore him, pretend that he does not exist. One of their favorite techniques is sarcasm. They would fit right in with the family I grew up in. And so this irony and pointed sarcasm is just oozing out of verses 5 and 7 as God responds to this rebellious city. Here they are, the Babylonians, the climax of the downward spiral of human rebellion that takes place from Genesis 3 all the way to Genesis 11. Right? That's a literary unit that really, it starts bad and it gets worse. And here they are, the climax of that. rejecting God's design for them by clustering together, placing themselves in the position of God by elevating themselves to the heavens, or so they think. And God is like, what's going on down there? No, I can't quite see. It's not big enough. So let's go down so that we can see what is happening there, right? It is just, it helps put into perspective for us exactly how small we are. When we think that we are elevating ourselves up to the level of God, God is the one who is in control. God is the one who is sovereign. I get to experience this kind of ridiculous rebellion every single night. In our house, we call it bedtime. Okay, maybe some of your parents understand this, right? I give my kids a clear mandate, okay? This is the time, just like every other night of your entire life that has ever happened. This is the time to get your jammies on, brush your teeth. We're not even tired! They're saying as they're so tired, they're crying. You think you can make us stay in bed? I will show you. I will come out every 10 minutes. And what happens? Every single night, right, mom and dad win, right? They do go to bed, and it is for their good. When God comes down to intervene and scatter this rebellious people, it is not because God is somehow threatened by the project that is going on here. This is God's mercy and grace. It is not as if Babylon has become some sort of rival that God has to squash before it gets too big, too powerful, that it's out of control. Right? This episode demonstrates God's uncontested power and sovereignty, that God's purposes for humanity and for creation, they will be accomplished, and nobody can thwart them. Doesn't matter how big they build a tower, nobody can thwart God's purposes. Secondly, however, this episode also demonstrates God's mercy. That might not be immediately apparent, but God comes down and intervenes out of his grace. He knows that this city that is built on rejection of his plan and rebellion, he knows that this project is going to be a disaster. He knows that this is going to end in oppression, in violence. He knows that he needs to put a stop to this before it gets out of hand. And so he short circuits it before its completion, and that is out of his grace and his mercy. Do you know that sometimes in God's mercy and grace that God allows your plans to fail instead of succeed? Sometimes when that happens in your life, that's not God being mad at you. That's God having mercy on your life because his perspective is infinitely larger than ours. It is for our own good that God sometimes causes our idolatrous plans to fail. God knows that our true joy, true life, and true satisfaction can only ever be found in him and him alone. And so he will slowly strip away everything else that we look to for those things. And that process is painful. We do not enjoy that process. But as we grow in maturity, and as we see the Lord working in our lives by stripping away the things that have become idols in our lives, we stop kicking and screaming and fighting against it, and we start asking, God, how can I learn from what you're teaching me in this time? So where do you look for life, for joy, for security, or like the Babylonians, for importance, for power, besides God? And what might it look like for God to graciously allow that to fail on you? Maybe it's a relationship, or maybe it's a career goal. Whatever it is, when God tears down idols in our lives, it's his grace. So now, how is Babylon used as a symbol in the Bible? What I want to do now is transition, kind of shift gears, and transition from an exposition of Genesis 11, 1 through 9. And what I want to do is open up how this theme of Babylon gets picked up and carried forward, the surprising twists and turns that it takes, how it finds its climax in the life, death, resurrection of Jesus, then how it finds its resolution in the new creation. And what I want to do now is show how this specific episode here in Babylon fits into the overarching theme of exile that literally stretches from Genesis chapter 3 to the very last page of the Bible. Exile is one of those major themes in the scriptures that if you start to clue into, it's one of those things that, like, once you see it, you start seeing it everywhere. In fact, I would argue that the entire Hebrew Old Testament is formed after this image of exile and an expected return. And so this is one of those themes that is really important for us as studiers, students of the Bible to wrap our heads around, start to see. And to do that, we have to first understand how we got to Babylon here in Genesis 11. And as you know, God's people began in his good land in the garden, Genesis 2. But then God asked them to trust and obey his instructions, not to take from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what did they do? They succumbed to the temptation of the serpent. They rebelled, they seized autonomy, placing themselves in the position of God, defining good and evil for themselves. And so what follows is a heartbreaking exile, right? They get kicked out of God's good land. So do you think that this garden story is modeled after the exile story? Of course it is. What follows is a heartbreaking exile out of God's presence, out of the garden, eastward, which ends up being an important detail, until we come to the bottom of the downward spiral of Genesis 3 to 11 here in Babylon. Okay? The exile out of the garden, however, it's not without hope. As you know, in Genesis 3, God promises a redeemer, one who is going to crush the serpent, bring his people back out of exile, restore God's blessing to humanity. And so there's a glimmer of hope, even in the midst of one of the darkest moments in the Bible. So how do we get from this exile here in Babylon to the next iteration of Babylon? How do we get from here to Egypt? Well, remember that detail that I told you to put a pin in, the bricks and the mortar. Interestingly, the author of the Pentateuch also brings out this detail in the next Babylon, which is Egypt, the next society that is unified in their rebellion against God and his purposes. And the author is a genius, and he links these with a small scriptural text detail. Let's read in Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 to 10, and then 13 to 14. It says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, 'Behold, the people of Israel are too many, too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land.'" Skipping to verse 13. "So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves." So I am fully aware that is a small textual detail. But sometimes, like I said, when the Bible gives you these small details, they're at least worth pursuing. Maybe you'll find something there. And in this case, I think that we do. I think that the author is trying to link Egypt and recall in the minds of the readers, oh, we've seen this sort of thing before. Right? Where have I seen this detail before? And you sort of import what you have read before about the society of Babylon, and you start to bring that to bear when you start reading about Egypt. So the biblical authors, they talk about Egypt using symbols from Babylon to describe a society united in rebellion against God and his purposes. And we see these pop up again and again throughout the biblical story and throughout their history. And as you know, God redeems his people out of Israel. And when he does, by his powerful strong arm, as they cross through the Red Sea, when God redeems his people out of their captivity in Israel, their captivity in Egypt, there's this wonderful picture as they're on the other side of the Red Sea, and as they're looking back at Pharaoh's armies and chariots pursuing them through the sea that's been opened up, there's this awesome picture that the sun is rising. It says that this is taking place during the morning watch. And as the sun begins to rise, God brings deliverance by wiping out Israel's enemies. And so what they do is they come to the other side of the Red Sea and they sing a song. It's one of the first songs recorded in the Bible. It's hugely important, Exodus 15. They sing a song about God's deliverance from their enemies, how with his strong arm he rescued them and delivered them. It starts to become known as the day of the Lord. It's a day that they look back and find hope to look forward as future kingdoms start to surround the kingdom of Israel, knocking at their door, threatening to overtake them, drag them back into exile. When that starts happening in their history, they look back at how God delivered them from Egypt, and that becomes a source of hope for them. So here's where things get interesting. After their deliverance from captivity, as they've established their kingdom, fast forward several hundred years, as the kingdoms surrounding Israel come knocking at the door, threatening to take them out and drag them off into exile, God commissions a shepherd named Amos to prophesy against God's enemies. Okay? And as you read the beginning of Amos, it reads kind of like a series of nuclear strikes around the borders of Israel. All these enemies that are surrounding them, threatening to overtake them. And what happens is it starts around the perimeter, but then it starts to zero in on the center. And so Amos starts in his beginning, and he's prophesying destruction against the land of Damascus. And you can hear Israel almost in the background, yeah, get Damascus. And then destruction against Gaza, keep going, Amos. Destruction against Tyre and Edom and the Ammonites and the Moabites. It's yeah, all right, come on, go, Amos. And then Judah. What? Are you serious, Amos? That's why nobody likes you. Okay? You can leave. Is Amos serious? Has Israel become one of God's enemies? Is the day of the Lord coming, but coming against Israel, God's own people? Amos is serious and very unpopular right now. And he spends literally the rest of the book describing and detailing how Israel has become the new Babylon, how their leaders have become corrupt, how they themselves have become the society that is united in rebellion against God. And so this motif of Babylon, it becomes something that nobody's able to escape from, right? The thought was that these were the bad guys who were out there, and now it becomes apparent that really the problem is in here. So it's in this situation, exactly as predicted, that Assyria wipes out the northern kingdom, and Babylon conquers and drags off the southern kingdom. And what follows is literally empire after empire after empire, from Babylon, then to Persia, then to Greece, then to Rome, just one kingdom after another, oppressing God's people in what seems to be a never-ending exile. And in this depressing situation, sitting in exile under Persia, Daniel receives a vision for hope, for how God is finally going to defeat the ultimate Babylon once and for all and restore God's rule of justice and righteousness. And you can read about this vision in Daniel chapter 7. It's really weird, like a lot of biblical visions. There's this sea that is turbulent and is roiling, and what is coming out of the sea are these beasts, and these beasts represent one kingdom after another. And then what happens is the final beast that is crushing the saints of the Lord is defeated, and there is a figure that becomes sort of the center of the hope of Daniel's vision. And this figure is called the Son of Man. And the Son of Man is exalted, is lifted up on the clouds before the Ancient of Days, before the God of Israel. And it is given, the Son of Man is given dominion. The Son of Man is given authority. The Son of Man is vindicated and brings God's rule and righteousness back to earth as it is in heaven. And so that becomes just a handle for the Israelites to hope for as they endure persecution under one kingdom after another. They're looking for this Son of Man who's going to redeem them, who's going to defeat Babylon. And then finally, when Jesus comes on the scene, he takes up that exact mantle. One of his favorite titles for himself is the Son of Man. It comes right out of Daniel 7, and everybody knows exactly what he's talking about. Or at least they think they know what he's talking about. Here is finally the one who is going to confront Babylon, which by now has turned into Rome. Here's the one who's going to redeem God's people out of exile and set up God's eternal kingdom on earth. That is what they're expecting from this prophet that is going around calling himself the Son of Man. But the way that Jesus redeems his people out of exile, and he does, He absolutely does. The way he redeems his people out of exile is not by kicking out the Romans like they were expecting. Instead, Jesus, the Son of Man, is lifted up in his crucifixion. That is portrayed as the exaltation of the Son of Man. And his vindication happens at his resurrection, details that were totally unexpected. On the cross, Jesus rescued his people from captivity. He really did. Not to Rome, but their enslavement to the true enemy that has been operating behind the scenes since the very beginning, all the way back in the garden. That enemy is who he redeemed his people from. Their slavery to their sin, to rebellion. At the cross, Jesus invites you and me to lay down the tools that we've been using to build our own Babylon, our own kingdom of rebellion, which, let's be honest, it's been a disaster. To repent, to turn to him in faith, and to find true life, true satisfaction, and true joy in him. After Jesus' resurrection, he's preparing his disciples for his departure. And this scene is described in Acts chapter 1. His disciples are starting to get what he's been about all this time. They're starting to understand, putting the dots together, but they're still kind of confused. And that confusion becomes apparent in Acts 1 as they ask Jesus just point blank, like, okay, so Jesus, is now the time that you're going to restore the kingdom back to Israel? Right? So they're still thinking that storyline. And the book of Revelation, it does wrap up the story of exile. It does tell the story of God's eventual battle against the ultimate Babylon. That's why that imagery is used in Revelation. And God does gain ultimate victory. He does restore his kingdom perfectly, consummately on earth as it is in heaven. But in the meantime, Jesus invites his followers here in Acts 1 to live in a paradox. Inviting them to live in a kingdom that really is here, but in other ways is not yet here. He invites them, the word he uses is witnesses. He invites them to live as witnesses of Jesus and of his kingdom in the midst of a world that still looks and operates an awful lot like Babylon. So there you've got this story of exile, this biblical theme that, like I said, runs from the beginning of Genesis all the way to the end, and how that really shapes a lot of how the biblical authors view their world. The apostles, they really seem to take this to heart after Jesus explains this to them. Peter especially. If you read Peter, his first letter, he addresses his readers as elect exiles. Okay, these are people who are living in their hometown. Some of them have been dispersed, but he addresses them as exiles. I think that's a connection, that we're supposed to see ourselves as exiles, even in the lands that we come from. And when he signs the letter at the end, it's really interesting. He's signing the letter, and he's signing a greeting from the church that he's from, and he calls his church, "She who is in Babylon." Right? This is 500 years after the destruction of Babylon. What is he on about? No, he is taking these lenses and he is using them to see his world, to see what is going on around him, and it informs his own identity as an exile. So aside from this biblical theme, now seeing this, aside from that being interesting, I really enjoy this sort of thing. I think it's fun. But aside from that, how do I, as a follower of Jesus, actually put this to work in my life? How does this make a difference in how I actually live in the real world? To conclude, what I want to do is I want to offer up a way to put this idea to work as you, followers of Jesus, seek to live as witnesses of Jesus in a society that is united in its rebellion against God, that looks and operates a lot like Babylon. So, how do I relate to Babylon? How does this make sense? How do I put this to work in my life? Well, it should come as no surprise to any of you that the current iteration of Babylon is none other than the Western secular society that we live in today, right? This is the society that is united in its rebellion against God. Our culture is built on rejecting and suppressing the truth of God and his glory, and instead idolizing any aspect of creation that they can find. So how are you called to resist Babylon today? Well, there are four different options that I've identified. Three of them traps that we can tend to fall into. And the first trap is that we will escape or hide ourselves from Babylon, right? These are the Christians that what their goal is, their mission in life is to just huddle together in the church. We're just going to enjoy each other's fellowship. We're going to keep ourselves away from the yucky stuff that is happening out in Babylon, okay? That's the escape/hide. So just seclude yourself and hang on until the return of Christ. Secondly, maybe you take the exact opposite road and you attack. Right? These are people that are sort of lobbing gospel grenades from the safety of like a blog or social media or something. They're not actually engaging, but man, they think that they're on the offensive. Standing on street corners, yelling at people, making self-righteous comments about your neighbors, your coworkers. Right? Is that the stance that you take towards Babylon, attack mode? Or third, to assimilate. Right? And I just want to ask, do you know that you're in exile? Do you know that this society is not your home? Or have you assimilated so much that you look exactly like everyone else around you? That you've just chosen the path of least resistance? That you've listened to what this culture tells you to do with your faith, which is to keep it private, keep it hidden, just don't bring it up. That belongs somewhere else. What I want to offer is a fourth way to relate to the society that you live in, to relate with Babylon, and that is to engage and subvert. And what I want to do to describe this is give you two examples, one biblical example and then one example from my own life of how to engage and subvert Babylon. Now, biblical example. You know who is a wonderful example of how to be one of God's people living in the midst of Babylon and engaging and subverting that in a way that is thoughtful and strategic? You know who's a great example of this? Daniel. He actually lived in Babylon. And you know what's fun about Daniel? Actually all biblical heroes, aside from Jesus, they are all mixed bags, right? They have their high points, but man, they have their low points. Daniel, stands out. I'm not saying Daniel is perfect, but he's portrayed in the Bible as one that we should emulate. And so I think he's a fantastic example of how to engage and subvert Babylon. Read his story in the book of Daniel. The way that Daniel navigates life in Babylon is not what you would expect. He does not fall into any of those first three traps. Daniel is thoughtful, Daniel is strategic, but Daniel is also subversive and unquestionably loyal to his God and the way that he interacts and operates in Babylon. Okay, so Daniel, his name, let's start there. His name means God is my judge. It's a Hebrew name. And in that culture, your names were a significant part of your identity. When he goes to Babylon, he's given a new name, Belteshazzar. It means Bel will sustain the king's life. So his part of his core identity is taken from him, and then he's met with something else. He accepts his new name, all right? Daniel works for the government, and he's a high-ranking official. He works for the very empire that broke down the walls of his home city, and he does a good job. He's a good employee. He shows up on time. He gets promoted. So the way that Daniel engages Babylon is not to hide, and it's not to attack. Right? He's not planting explosives around Babylon, trying to overthrow it. But Daniel is subversive. Daniel chapter 1, where he draws the line is vegetables, of all things. What's put before him is food that's been sacrificed to idols. He says, no, that will compromise my identity as one of God's people. So I'll make you a deal. Me and my friends will eat what is okay for us to eat, and then you can compare afterwards. What I love about that story is there's no one-to-one correlation that you can make. There's nowhere is that going to come up in your day-to-day life. So what you have to do when you read that and ask yourself, okay, how can I be like Daniel? You have to ask yourself, what are those things that I'm being asked to do that are going to compromise my identity, my allegiance to the one true God? Daniel is a fantastic example for how to engage and subvert Babylon today. So, how can you and I engage and subvert Babylon? How can we take Daniel's example? How can you in your life expose the idols that the world around you is chasing after as the counterfeit gods that they are, and point your friends and your neighbors to the true life that is only found in Jesus. What you do is you pay attention. You come into this world and you have your eyes open. You pay attention to what this culture is idolizing, what they're going after and failing at, and you build something better. Here's what I mean. When I think about how I personally can engage this Babylonian culture around me and subvert the idols of sex and power that it's chasing after with disastrous consequences, by the way, by building something better, what I think about is how my own marriage can be an example, how I can go about building a culture just at my own home in a way that is visible to those around me, in a way that when those around me who are trying to go after things that are good, but they've become idols, that they can see this is how a marriage works when you follow God's design. Maybe there's something to that, right? This secular culture that we live in, Western secularism, has been described as the pursuit of the kingdom without the king. Right? So what this culture is going after, oftentimes they're good things. They're just failing at them because they do not have allegiance to God. They've rejected God's plan. They've rejected God's design, but they're still chasing after these things that our hearts were built for. And so when the cracks show, when they start to become obvious, when their lives are not working out because they've not followed God's design, and what you are building because you are one of God's people, right? Because you are going about your marriage, for example, in a way that is honoring to God. You're following his design, right? The goal is not that that would stay hidden, but that you would live your life visibly in a way that other people can see. I think that this is what Jesus means when he says in Matthew 5, to let your light shine before men so that they may see your good deeds and glorify their Father that is in heaven. So this is what we are called to engage in Babylon in a way that is subversive, that points out the idols, but then invites the people around us into the true life, true joy, true satisfaction that can only ever be found in Jesus, that invites them into the new way of being human, that Jesus opens up for each of us at the cross. So there you have it. What started as just 9 short verses about a tower in Babylon got picked up and carried forward in a big way by biblical authors and used as a symbol for exile, found its climax in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and its resolution in the new creation. And this is the story that Jesus is inviting you into, to lay down your life of pride and rebellion and to find true life in him, and then to go out and be witnesses as he brings his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for how it exposes the idols in our hearts. Thank you for how it draws back the curtain and helps us to see what is actually going on. And God, I pray that this story would be something that we enter into, that you would help us to use these set of lenses to view our life and the world around us. And God, that as a result of seeing that we would go out and be your witnesses in this world. In your name, amen.